I teach in the political science program at Morris. My main areas are kind of American government, political philosophy, religion, politics, but I also do work on war and peace issues, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And the other thing we tend to talk about when we talk about religious liberty, again, not surprising, is individuals. So if this particular individual have a right to X, Y, or Z, high school football coach who wants to say a prayer at the 50-yard line after the game, or someone who works at a bakery being asked to bake a cake for same-sex marriage, or a Sikh who wears a turban as part of his religion, being able to serve in the military without having to remove the turban, things like that. So our individual rights being respected. Again, that's important, but also religious liberty is important for groups, for institutions. So something near and dear to me in the last few weeks is are religious colleges being forced to rewrite their mission statements to take out certain words so they don't lose all their government funding and have to shut down. So that's an institution that whose religious liberty, to my reading, is being threatened by government punitive action. So it's not just individuals, but it's groups. And I'm going to be talking more about groups tonight rather than just individuals. So with that being said, one of the things I do study is war and peace. I study the ethical side of things, the moral arguments about war and peace, mainly within the Catholic tradition. But also as a political scientist, I look at empirical data on war and peace, basically what we know from research about the nature of armed conflict and efforts to solve it, head it off, things like that. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, that side of my research this evening. I just want to highlight kind of three broad areas of how protecting religious liberty for distinctive religious groups can help contribute to reductions in armed conflict and warfare around the world. And then hopefully answer questions, or if you want to hear more about particular things or implications or takes, kind of the discussion of what all this means for those of us who care about a world that has less war and more peace, right? So I'm going to start with the broadest area, what we know about the risk factors of war. So most countries in the world today are not experiencing war, but plenty are. Sometimes it's interstate war, so war between two countries, Russia invading Ukraine, but more often it's civil wars. Places like Myanmar or Sudan, South Sudan, or Sudan and South Sudan, or Yemen, where you have war within a particular country, usually between the government and one or more armed groups, right? There are certain things we know makes it more likely that a country is going to experience warfare. So, hit some of the highlights. Here's some of the key economic factors associated with lowering your odds that a country will experience warfare. Just like my doctor tells me, actually she's a nurse practitioner, she tells me, if you want to lower your odds for this, this, and this, drink less, take this little white pill every day, and cut down all the cholesterol. So if a country wants to reduce its odds for war, reductions in poverty brought by widely shared economic development. So the lower a country's poverty, the lower its odds of experiencing war. Rising GDP means less risk for war. Lower economic inequality, and this is interesting, not necessarily between individuals. So the United States has very high economic inequality, but it's mainly between individuals as well as groups. But for warfare, it's mainly lower your economic inequality among ethnic, religious, or regional groups. So if you have certain groups that are much poorer than other groups in society, it becomes more likely you're going to have war. Greater openness to international trade and investment. That produces broad economic diversification and reduces dependency on extracting certain resources like oil and diamonds. So if your economy is mainly based on exporting oil and diamonds, you have a high risk of armed conflict. Increased literacy and educational attainment, especially for girls. Greater opportunities for women to participate in the labor force associated with a low risk of war. And shifting resources away from military spending towards human welfare, such as reductions in hunger, malnutrition, and infant mortality. So things like the the wider childhood immunizations a country has, the less risk it's going to experience warfare. Not because the measles vaccine makes you less likely to be a soldier or something, but basically it means the country has a stronger public health infrastructure, which means they're less likely to experience instability and armed conflict, right? All right, similarly, here's some key political factors associated with lower odds of war. If a country has democratic institutions rather than autocratic ones, and especially if they're inclusive, that is, they are able to have broad-based political participation, and especially have representation across ethnic, religious, or regional groups. Again, if you politically marginalize certain groups, you're going to have more likely they're going to take up arms in response. You're going to get war. Greater female participation in government, especially representatives in legislatures. So you can see it on a chart. The higher the percentage of women in your legislature, the lower your risk of armed conflict. Interestingly enough, in only legislatures, female presidents or prime ministers don't make any difference on the chances you're going to experience war. But in legislatures, the percentage of women goes up, the chance of war goes down. Strong human rights protections, especially that safeguard minority rights such as language rights or religious rights, are associated with lower risk of war. Basic governing capacity, so the ability of a country's government to deliver basic services, clean water, postal delivery, courts, the rule of law, you're going to have less warfare. Related to that, ways that average citizens can hold government officials accountable for corruption. Corruption is associated with more risk of war, and so ways you can fight corruption lowers the risk of war. And then finally, a free and vibrant civil society. So civil society is what we're doing tonight. It's public organizations and activities that aren't part of the government. So public and non-governmental. So the stronger, more vibrant a civil society you have, churches, book clubs, bowling leagues, those kinds of things, the lower your risk of armed conflict. So the role of religious liberty in this first sort of catalog of things, notice that one of the biggest risk factors for war is if particular groups, including religious groups, become marginalized economically and politically. If you suppress a religious minority, it means you're more likely to experience armed conflict, because that minority often will take up arms and start a civil war, or try and break off informants in the country, something like that. So strong religious liberty rights prevent this, kind of like what we heard from our first keynote. Religious liberty tends to reduce religious warfare. But also general human rights, including religious liberty, are associated with lower risk of armed conflict and a vibrant civil society. Vibrant civil societies often include key religious organizations and institutions. Again, from the first keynote, you heard that religious people tend to participate in things more than non-religious people. So they tend to volunteer, give money to charity. So a vibrant civil society often has lots of religious believers. Generally speaking, a vibrant civil society is going to have lots of secular people. It's also going to have lots of believers, and especially religious organizations as part of it. And that's associated with a lower risk of armed conflict. Another important, and at least for me, interesting area is stopping wars before they start. So alternative conflict resolution. War has always been one way that either countries solve disputes or groups within countries solve disputes, is armed force. Since the Second World War, we've sort of developed certainly not foolproof, but a somewhat effective web of institutions that allow countries in particular to solve disputes without having to resort to warfare. But the key is they didn't fight a war because arbitration and mediation, we didn't hear about it, but that's because it was successful, right? No one ever calls a plumber when everything's working fine. It's only when things don't work that you get action. Turns out that countries that participate more in international organizations have a lower risk, again, of armed conflict. And it helps create new norms. So one of the main reasons countries used to go to war was to collect debts. Our bankers are owed money by your government or your citizens you've defaulted on your loan, we're going to go to war. No one goes to war to collect debts anymore. There's other ways you collect debts from foreign nationals. So you come up with new norms and new ways of solving conflicts that have reduced war, especially war between countries. Still happens, Russia, Ukraine, but the number of wars between two separate countries is much lower than it used to be, which is why today most wars are civil wars. And most of those are actually restarts. So chronic wars that start, they stop, fighting resumes, it stops, fighting resumes. So most civil wars are these chronic cycles of stop and start. If you want to break that cycle and bring peace to a civil war, military intervention, sending in foreign troops, almost never works. It tends to make the war bloodier and longer. But if international pressure can get that ceasefire in place, then take the pause to get a negotiated settlement, and then have a third party make sure that settlement is being followed, basically a trusted mediator. Participation, again, of women in the peace process, so the more women are involved in this negotiation, the more likely it is to be successful, and the more likely religious leaders are involved, the more likely it is to be successful. So in this area, you can see that vibrant religious communities, especially religious organizations or institutions that are not co-opted or controlled by the government, they're really independent, they often have a key role to play in this entire process. They're big supporters of building this network, so they're some of the main supporters for advocating for new ways of solving international disputes. They're often actors in that. A lot of those NGOs, international NGOs, are religious-based organizations. They often are the actual mediators in the conflicts. So one of my areas is Irish Studies. I teach a course on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and the Catholics and the Protestants had a 400-year history, roughly, of chronic warfare. They wouldn't talk to each other, but they would pass notes through a monastery outside Belfast, because the monks there, both sides trusted the monks. So religious organizations actually are oftentimes the only trusted people who can help mediate a conflict, because the two parties don't trust each other at all. So sometimes you have those organizations. And then again, the more religious leaders participate in the actual peace negotiations and peace process, the more it has legitimacy and the more likely it is to succeed. And then the third area, this is one that I'm particularly interested in my research and writing, is the emergence over the last century or so a really powerful alternative to warfare, which is nonviolent civil resistance movements. We even have a helpful picture of Gandhi on the wall right there. So people like Gandhi, people like Cory Aquino in the Philippines, like Lech Walesa in Poland, you have lots of groups have used techniques of non-cooperation to basically withdraw authority from leaders. We have this ability as humans to basically take away power from those who have it. And so especially with strikes, demonstrations, boycotts, security force defection, where the police and the army refuse to carry out a dictator's orders anymore, it's become a powerful tool to defeat dictators or foreign occupiers or colonial powers like Gandhi, not having to use armed force. And it turns out it's more effective than armed force. Not because it always works, it doesn't, but because armed force actually is not a very effective way to achieve goals. So I'm a huge soccer fan, and when my team gives up a penalty kick at the very end of a game, a free kick from the spot, I'm super upset because I know there's only a 15% chance that the goalkeeper is going to save that kick. If you're football fans, if you're tied, the opposing team has the ball, they're marching down the field, they run down the clock, 1 second left, they have time for one more play, they're going to kick a 40-yard field goal. There's a 15% chance they're going to miss that field goal. So you have hope, but you probably shouldn't count on it. 85% of the time, your team's going to lose, right? Turns out that most wars end with neither side achieving their goals. They don't get what they're fighting for. And only 15% of the time does a party basically get what it's fighting for. So if you take up arms as a country or a group, only about 50% of the time now are you going to get what you're fighting for. Are you going to achieve success, right? Again, it's not zero, but it's not very good. Nonviolent civil resistance movements, toppling dictators, overthrowing foreign occupiers, they now are down to, they used to be 50%, now they're down to about 30%. So they're still twice as successful as armed force, even though neither one has better than even odds of success. Dictators have gotten pretty good at staying in power. But nonviolence is twice as effective. And in almost every successful campaign of nonviolent civil resistance, religious organizations play a key role. Unions are the other big organization that often plays a role, or professional associations, like doctors, lawyers, things like that. But churches almost always play a key role in helping to non-violently overthrow oppressive regimes. So here too, a vibrant religious organizations that are protected from government control and government interference by religious liberty then can be a powerful tool for non-violently working for social change.